story that has been hidden for decades has been brought to light by James Garner. Hollywood is full of stories that have been told but never told. The history goes back to the set of The Great Escape, the famous war movie from 1963. But behind the scenes, things were getting tense, especially between Garner and Charles Bronson, who was becoming a big star. Garner stayed quiet for years and wouldn't stir the pot, but now he's speaking up. What he says about Bronson is shocking and very personal. What made the fight happen? What caused the anger to last so long? And what happened that almost led to a fight? Keep listening to find out. James Garner's story is like a rough coming-of-age tale that takes place during some of the worst years in American history. Not a single thing in his early life was easy. He was born in Norman, Oklahoma during the Great Depression. Weldon Bumner, his dad, ran a hardware shop and did everything he could to support the family. But bad things happened quickly. James's mother, who was half Cherokee, died when he was only 4 years old. Years later, James would say that he knew she had died because of an abortion that went wrong. Soon after, tragedy struck again when Weldon's hardware store burned down. To make money, he started laying carpets. Weldon's drinking problem got worse with the new job, and the house turned into a scary place. He would get home drunk and make his boys sing for dinner. If they didn't want to, he would beat them. Things got so bad that he eventually sent each son to live with a different relative. Weldon got married again and brought the boys back home. This should have been a good thing, but it wasn't. Wilma, his new stepmother, who he called Red, was even more violent than he was. She beat the boys with branches they had to get ready for, and James took the most damage. Not only did Red hurt him physically, she also made fun of him by making him wear her dresses and makeup. By the time he was in his early teens, James had had enough. At age 14, he lost it during one of Red's attacks and started to choke her. His father had to stop him. Later, James would say that he might have killed her if his dad hadn't stepped in. After that scary event, Weldon did what he always did. He left. This time he left his kids all alone, leaving James to take care of himself. Despite everything, James didn't give up. He dropped out of high school and lied about his age to join the Merchant Navy at 16, just as World War II was ending. He tried to swim in the ocean, but it made him very sick, so he quickly left. When he got back to land, he worked at gas stations, laid carpets, and even modeled underwear. That job gave him his first taste of show business. By 1950, James was back in Los Angeles living with his dad. He was still lost and trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life after his second visit to the city. Then the Korean War happened. James was the first person from Oklahoma to be drafted because he was still legally a resident of the state. He was sent overseas with the 5th Regimental Combat Team of the 24th Division and fought for 9 months. His war stories were like scenes from an action movie, but they were real and hurt. On his second day in Korea, shrapnel hit him in the hand and face. Later, U.S. planes mistakenly thought his unit was the enemy and opened fire, hitting James in the back as he ran for cover. He hurt his shoulder and made his already bad knees worse when he fell off a cliff while trying to get out of a foxhole. He later said that the military saw him as just another body to fill the gap. James' quirks show even when he is in battle. One night while on guard duty, he smelled garlic in the air and it made his stomach turn. Even more than onions, he hated garlic. He could smell it in the smallest amounts, even if a pan wasn't clean. That night the smell was awful. Someone in the line told him that North Korean or Chinese troops were close. He told his unit what was going on, and thanks to his good sense of smell, they were ready. After the war, James went back to Los Angeles and did odd jobs again. At one point he was laying carpets again, this time with his dad. He also pumped gas at a nearby station, which is where fate intervened. He met Paul Gregory, who told him he was starting a talent agency because he thought James looked like he could be an actor. At the time, James didn't think much of it. Years later, James saw Paul's name on the door of a talent agency and decided to stop by. That unplanned visit changed everything. Paul took a chance on him and got James his first real acting job, a part in the stage production of the Caine Mutiny Court-Martial. Fast forward to 1957, and James Garner was on fire. That year he starred with Marlon Brando in Sayonara and made a big splash on TV as Brett Maverick, the slick-talking smart gambler in the hit show Maverick. The show was about Brett and his brother Bart as they traveled through the Wild West looking for money, adventure, and the occasional poker game. James Garner played Brett and Jack Kelly played Bart, switching roles every episode. From the beginning it was clear that James Garner was the best actor. Fans loved him because he wasn't your typical gunslinger cowboy. He was smart, charming, and didn't always win fights with fists or guns. For the first few seasons everything was going great. Garner was becoming a household name and making a strong name for himself in the Western genre, which was big at the time. But in 1960 the Writers Guild of America went on strike, which stopped all production in Hollywood. Maverick, like most shows, stopped getting new scripts. Garner's problem was that he had signed a 52E contract with Warner Brothers that paid him only $1,250 a week, which wasn't much given how popular the show had become. The studio said they didn't have to pay him because there were no scripts, which didn't sit well with Garner. He was sick of being used as a pawn by the studio, so he stood up and sued Warner Brothers for breach of contract. He won, and it was clear that the court agreed with him. During the strike, the studio couldn't just stop paying him. Warner Brothers tried to make things better with a new deal, but Garner was set on leaving Maverick. But that wasn't the end for him or the fans of the show. Then came 1963, and The Great Escape became one of the most famous war movies of all time. It had a daring prison break, a heart-pounding plot, and a cast full of Hollywood big names, including Steve McQueen, who was unquestionably the coolest guy ever. But even though there was a lot going on in the movie, the real drama was happening behind the scenes, especially between Charles Bronson and James Garner, two of the movie's main actors. At the time, Bronson wasn't quite the tough guy he'd become, but he was still working his way up the Hollywood ladder. 821 Garner, on the other hand, was already feeling great after his success on the TV show Maverick. So you'd think that when these two met on set they'd respect each other. What James Garner himself says, though, is that couldn't be more false. From the start it looks like Bronson and Garner didn't get along. That's not all Garner had to say about Bronson. He called him cold, rude, and mean. The fights were so bad that Garner kept talking about how tough Bronson was for decades after the movie was over. When Bronson died in the early 2000s, Garner finally wrote his book and shared all of these behind-the-scenes memories. He painted a picture of a man who was not only difficult to work with but also hostile. That being said, Bronson wasn't the only problem Garner had on set. Even his friend Steve McQueen, who became the movie's big star, wasn't safe. Garner said that McQueen's pride got the best of him while they were shooting. Still, Steve may have had some diva moments, but Garner finally said it was just because he loved the role and let it go. Bronson, on the other hand, held a grudge for life. Now let's look at how the group worked together to fully understand why things went so badly. McQueen was the golden boy and Garner was the TV star who was ready to take the movie world by storm. Bronson, on the other hand, still had something to show. Maybe he felt like he had to puff up his chest just to keep up with all the big names. He did puff up. He was said to have been acting like a top-billed star when he wasn't. Many people didn't like how Bronson acted because they thought it wasn't because he cared about the part but because he wanted to rule the set. After years had passed, Garner told a story that really said it all. When the movie was over, he asked Bronson to come over for a friendly game of cards. It may have been an act of peace or a last chance to be polite, but things quickly got worse. When Bronson tried to back out of a bet he'd already made, he did so with both Garner and a young stagehand who couldn't lose that much money. Garner would not sit for it. Things got angry when he stood up for the kid and told Bronson to pay the $50 he owed. Blaine got very angry and the two almost fought. That was the last time Garner ever asked Bronson to come over. Their fight was over after that. It didn't calm down when The Great Escape became a hit. 11 o'clock. Charles Bronson really meant it when he said he would never work with James Garner again. But fate had other plans. After many years, the two men were having dinner together, each with his wife. Jill Ireland is with Bronson and Lois Clark is with Garner. The women got along right away and talked like they were old friends. Not so much for the men. As the night went on, Garner and Bronson sat stiffly and barely spoke, trying to get through it without getting into an argument again. But for James Garner, the most interesting part was yet to come. When the Rockford Files first came out on TV in 1974, it didn't take long for it to become a big hit. It wasn't like other police shows though, it was different and had its own style. The part of Jim Rockford was taken over by James Garner, a private eye who works on the beach in an old trailer and wears a bedsheet. He often gets into trouble that most people would try to avoid. His gold Pontiac Firebird, which has become an icon, hummed along with him the whole time. The show stood out because of how different Rockford was, very different from other action heroes of the time. He wasn't smooth, he wasn't flashy, he was tough, easy to relate to, and always a little down on his luck. The best part was that Garner made him do all of his tricks. He wanted to stay true to himself even when he was in a high-speed car chase or punching people in parking lots. And there were no action doubles. It was just Garner, a car, and a lot of grit. The Rockford Files, on the other hand, had more car chases and clever story twists than firearms. But those stunts were not funny. He had been practicing driving since he was in his early movies. He was a pro behind the wheel by the time Rockford came around. But as the years went by, doing all those stunts became harder on the body. They began to catch up with him. His back, his knees, and everything else began to hurt. When the 6th season came around, his doctor told him some bad news. He had to go more slowly. There Garner saw something very important. That's when he stopped being Jim Rockford. He couldn't be the guy doing the acts. NBC also knew it. The show didn't make sense to keep going without him in the spotlight, especially since the costs of making it were rising. Besides all of that, Garner was going through more than just pain. He was in court with NBC because he wanted a cut of the money made from shows. At the same time, he had major surgery on his heart. He was having a hard time at work and in his personal life, but it showed how hard he had worked to make the Rockford Files a hit. Also, the show wasn't cheap to make since it was a hit. It broke down so often while shooting that they had to get a new one several times a season. Not to mention how much it costs to fix things after almost every show. When you add in the higher costs of guest stars and more complicated scenes, NBC was having a hard time making ends meet. People still couldn't get enough of the show's charm. Fans loved the joke about Rockford's answering machine at the beginning of every episode. He never picked up the phone, so you would hear a different, often funny voicemail. It got so hard to come up with new jokes every week that the writers started asking anyone who worked at NBC for ideas. There was also some serious talent behind the scenes. David Chase, who would go on to create The Sopranos, wrote for the show, and Mike Post, who would later write the theme music for Law & Order, made the catchy music. Despite all the drama behind the scenes and the physical toll it was taking on him, the Rockford Files stayed a big hit. It wasn't just a return to TV for James Garner, it was a statement. After Maverick, this showed that he still had the charm, the grit, and that undeniable spark. But unlike when he was younger, doing his own stunts started to wear him down. Over time he got hurt more and more, and it wasn't just his health that got worse. The show ended because it became too much to handle, not because people stopped watching, but because the costs of making it were too high. But Garner wasn't ready to slow down. He kept showing off and acting well into the 2000s. In Space Cowboys, he starred with Clint Eastwood, Donald Sutherland, and Tommy Lee Jones as retired astronauts who are called back into action to fix an old Cold War satellite. There was a lot of action, humor, and nostalgia in the movie, and 4 Hollywood legends played characters who, even though they were old, were still able to save the day. However, things weren't quite as smooth behind the scenes. The actors had to wear spacesuits that were stiff, heavy, and very hard to move around in. Tommy Lee Jones, the youngest of the group at 53 years old, complained about how uncomfortable they were. And it wasn't just talk. Donald Sutherland actually fell backwards in his suit and broke his knee, and James Garner, who was 72 at the time, also fell and dislocated his shoulder during a scene. But here's the thing, Sutherland and Garner kept filming even though they were hurt. And in a scene that sounds more like a movie than real life, Clint Eastwood stepped in to help. He gave Garner first aid on the spot and even put his shoulder back in place.
It turns out that Clint had experience with shoulder dislocations from a movie he was in back in the 1970s, so he knew exactly what to do. But Garner, being the tough guy he always was, didn't go home to rest. He finished filming that day instead. Eastwood later said it took him a lot longer to get back to golfing after having shoulder problems. Also, Garner never blamed his age for the accident, he just said he was careless. The only time he thought he and the rest of the cast might not have been at their best was during a scene where they had to show their behinds. Sutherland later joked that he desperately looked for something to cover himself up but couldn't find anything. He laughed that gravity had already done its thing by that point. Though Garner paid the price over the years for always wanting to do his acts. Years of action scenes and physical comedy caused him to. He had long-term injuries, mostly to his knees and back. By the time he was older, those injuries had gotten worse. He had many surgeries, including knee surgeries, every time he took a break from acting for 5 years in a row. He finally had to stop doing stunts because they were too hard on his knees and back. In 1988 he had surgery to clear a blockage in his heart, and in 2008 he had another surgery after having a mild stroke. Playing Jim Rockford for 6 intense seasons was very hard on him. Still, he kept going with the same toughness and drive that made him famous. When asked why he quit the Rockford Files, Garner said that one injury had caused another. He hurt his back while limping on one leg. The medicine made his stomach hurt, and over time it also made him sad. This is what happens when you push your body for decades without stopping. On top of that, he had a sinus problem for 4 years that wasn't helped by medicine. It was caused by a bone growth blocking one of his sinuses. His anxiety was something he had to live with all the time. It was always there and made him feel bad. Many people think it also affected his health. In the 1970s, when his job was very stressful, he got ulcers and even split up with his wife for a while. During those breaks, Garner explained, he went back and forth between Canada and a rented home in the valley. He was quick to say that the separations weren't because of problems in the relationship, but because of the stress of his job. Eventually, Garner and his wife got back together, and they stayed together until his death in 2014. At the age of 86, he died of a heart attack. 7 years later, in October 2021, his wife also died. Throughout it all, James Garner never stopped being the tough guy with a big heart that people loved for decades.